Good morning. Today is June 28th, and we will be talking about some of the major court rulings that happened out of the Supreme Court this past Friday. But first, we want to give an update on the 12-day war with Iran and Israel. So, Senator, what do you have for us today?
Well, we'll be very general about the war. Of course, the United States launched a surprise attack on Iran using the bunker buster bombs, and the to at least some degree, the attack that was authorized by President Trump was rather surgical. It wasn't the broad kind of bombing campaign that Israel launched. And my impression is that it was the president's desire to keep it focused and to avoid having it explode into something greater. Now, right away, you can see the Israeli war lobby coming in saying, "Well, we didn't knock out all of the nuclear capability and so forth." And the way that ends, if you follow that rationale logically, it ends up with U.S. troops on the ground in Iran. And President Trump doesn't want that, because if we end up with U.S. troops on the ground in Iran, then Republicans lose the midterm elections, and essentially the president's term in office ends up being suspended at midterm. So the president's walking a tightrope, because the tremendous amount of funding that comes from the Israeli lobby, the globalist billionaires who fund huge campaigns like the midterm elections. He's got to have the funding to do that, and but at the same time, there is this nascent anti-war movement that it has not gained any traction at all on the Democratic side. But I know from personal experience, when the great and powerful George Bush declared war on Iraq, it was a grand and glorious thing. Everybody was just touting how wonderful it was that we had attacked this demon over there. And of course, he was not a demon. He was a very strong leader, and Saddam Hussein was. And anyway, we ended up killing 1 or 2 million people. There never were weapons of mass destruction. That was just a pretext. And the whole thing started to come unglued. And I was very known as a military figure, and was a member of the House of Delegates at the time. And ironically, I probably was the least enthusiastic of any of the members of the House of Delegates about the Iraq War, because I could see where it was going and how it had progressed. And in any event, it came election time. The Democrats had formed Code Pink, very powerful anti-war movement, and it really slammed all of the Republican members of the House of Delegates in Northern Virginia. There were 5 of them that won re-election by 1% or less. So they scraped in by just their fingernails. I lost by a couple of points, because I think I was just sort of the most visible target. Even, nobody really knew, okay, what's Black's view on the war in Iraq. I mean, friends did, but in any event, I lost that election. And so, those things, I was so relieved to be out of the House of Delegates. I had been in just constant campaign mode for 8 years, and it was just such a great relief to say, I can put down the spear and go back to having a more relaxed life. So I thought, but in any event, there's a great danger. These wars that seem so grand and glorious, like for Churchill, the Second World War, it was grand and glorious. He was treated like a god until the war ended, and then boom, he was out of office. Here was the great figure, people making statues of him, and all of a sudden he loses election. So it's something that Republicans have got to be careful about. There is this struggle, and you can already see it. There is this coalescing of Republican and Democrat pro-war people who are looking for the great World War III, and they are determined to drag President Trump into eventually a ground war. And they won't even touch on ground war, but they're talking about regime change, talking about overthrowing the government of Iran and replacing it. There's a group, it's MEK. We actually captured them. It's sort of a Marxist group, violent Marxist group that we captured during the Iraq War. They sided with Iraq against Iran, so they were traitors to their own country. And anyway, the U.S. is very good about this. We'll take these terrorist groups, and we don't crush them and destroy them. We preserve them, and we sort of keep them on ice a while because we might need them later on. So I think the plan would be that we would institute some sort of an internal revolution in Iran. The MEK, which is very hated by the Iranian people, would be installed as the new puppet regime, and we've also put ISIS on ice. We captured a huge force of ISIS, which probably are the most hideous soldiers on earth. I mean, they make the Nazis look like choir boys. These are people who were crucifying people, who were burning them alive, who had organized slave markets to sell women and children and little girls to be raped by men. And we were very careful not to destroy them, not to, tear apart their homes, their families and all, because we had them caught in the desert. We could easily have just annihilated them, which we should have done. It was an evil group, but we didn't. And so I've watched them over the years, and we very carefully nurtured that group, made sure that all of their families were well cared for, and we preserved them because one of our ways of making war is to use terrorism. And the plan would be, when the time comes, we move these ISIS killers into Iran. We also keep them preserved in case we need them against China with the Uyghurs. So anyway, it's a long explanation, but we have this tenuous peace right now. Both, the Israelis stopped their bombing, the Iranians stopped their missiles, and so we just hold our breath and see how long President Trump can stave this off. He's already hinted that, if necessary, he'll go back in and do some more. So we will see what happens.
Yes, it's very important to keep our eyes on this. And you kind of alluded to these oligarchical class that continues to want war with the projected aim to get a third world war, to have all of their policies enacted, and it's very interesting you say that. I know that at the NATO summit a few days ago, you had a lot of people fomenting the projected war on China. Again,
Yeah.
and you have some of our, I would say, the technocratic oligarchs that fund a lot of these campaigns. Alex Karp from Palantir essentially stated that we need to be ready to fight a war with China, Russia, and Iran are the three big ones. They continue to foment this, even though the people don't want it. And I think, if we were to have American boots on the ground in Iran, you would see a huge shift in coalescing of both right and left people who do not want war, when you have sons and daughters coming home in caskets and body bags, much like with the war in Iraq, when you had, I think, over 1 million people marching to stop it. It's just this continually progression of conflict when the people don't want it, and we see right through it, even though the media wants us to remain complicit and dumb. So I'm glad that we took this moment to speak on that.
Yeah,
Now,
you might just say, what would happen to a war if it started and nobody came? And in a sense, America's 12-year war, or 12-day war rather, President Trump's 12-day war with Iran was somewhat that way. You had this sudden announcement. Okay, we're bombing Iran now. The administration had said we're going to give Iran, I don't know what it was, 2 weeks or something to resolve these issues, and then that was a pretext. That was a cover. It was a little sort of a mini Pearl Harbor type attack, and it was announced with great drama, and nobody got real excited. Nobody ran out to the streets and started cheering and said, "Yeah, war, war, war." Everybody kind of winced a little and said, "I hope this turns out okay." I didn't see any enthusiasm among the American people for what was being done. And these grand, stealth bombers and so forth are flying over there and heroically pressing a button, and the computers drop a bomb and they turn around and go back. No, it just somehow, the war didn't feel very heroic. It just, it was dropping bombs on people who couldn't respond. And I think what was happening is there's a tremendous amount of blowback within the Republican conservative element, the genuine conservatives, the American First conservatives. And you had people like Tucker Carlson and Bannon and just a whole array of different people who were starkly opposed to attacking Iran. And so I think, Trump had to be aware that his powerfully united coalition was starting to have a very sharp fissure that potentially could cause a division. And again, the midterm elections are out there. They're still some time away, but you don't want the cloud of war hanging over them.
Yes, I agree. And I do some organizing with Veterans for Peace down here, and we did a demonstration Monday where we held up signs saying "No war on Iran," and you had majority of people that were passing by honking in support. So you had a very palpable disdain for another engagement in the Middle East. It was quite something to see. A lot of veterans were out there and holding up their signs, Veterans for Peace, and no war in Iran, and you had a lot of people honking in support of that. So that was really something beautiful to see, I think.
Well, it's interesting, just gauging the reaction that you were getting. Um, there's sort of a lot of subliminal opposition to yet another. I mean, I couldn't even tell you the number of wars we have fought for Israel in the Middle East. It just is, it's endless. I mean, this one, that one. There's not a single country you can look at that the United States has invaded since the George Bush times that has done anything other than suffer and degrade the country, lower their life expectancy, disintegrate their public institution, destroy their infrastructure. You can't point to a single one where you can say, oh, but in this case, this country just really flourished. Mm-hmm. They had cast off the evils of dictatorship, and the people now are singing Hosanna. Look at this. Look what we've achieved. Not one. In each of these cases, hundreds of thousands of innocent people are killed. The ancient, I mean, all the ancient things, the buildings that go back thousands of years are destroyed. The institutions, you look at Libya. Libya was the wealthiest, most advanced country in Africa. It was so powerful, not in terms of, external military stuff, but just in terms of the example that they presented for all of Africa, that they had agreed that they would issue a gold-backed African dinar, and Libya would sort of become the banker for Africa to make sure that there was sound money for all of Africa, and they would be able to advance. And that was, of course, one of the reasons that the Libyans had to be destroyed, is because there was an alternative currency. But the bigger reason is that we had set in place a plan to overthrow 7 independent sovereign countries within 5 years. The United States was going to do it, and Libya was first on the batting list. And the pitcher was there throwing a big bomb in their face and taking them out of the batter's box. And we went in, and this was a country, Libya, that was providing free housing to everyone. Now, I'm not into socialism and this kind of thing, but they had such enormous oil wealth at the time that they were able to do these things, and it worked. And Muammar Gaddafi, who's demonized, but who was really a saint in that country, he said, I will not put my own parents in a permanent house until every family in Libya has their families in homes. Mm. And his parents lived in I'm sure it was a very nice tent, but it was a tent structure. And he took very good care of them. It wasn't that he was on the outs with his parents, but he and his family were demonstrating such profound commitment to the country. And so you literally had poor goat herders who were having apartments built and this kind of thing. All education was totally free. All healthcare was totally free. All housing was totally free. And there was a tremendous amount of individual freedom for Libyans as well. Christians were protected, which was another thing that rubs the globalists the wrong way. They do not like these Christian communities in the Middle East. They want to see them purged. And they've done a very effective job of purging them. Mm-hmm. Now, there was not a big Christian community in Libya, but Gaddafi protected them very strictly. Anyway, so that's little rundown on that situation, people. I mean, people have every reason in the world to be just sick to their stomach over the idea of another Mideastern war of a magnitude greater than any one that we've fought so far.
Yeah, so Iran it's much larger. It's I know the placements of the mountains. It makes it a lot more direct combat kind of situation, whereas opposed to aerial combat is kind of what I've heard some of these military strategists kind of claim it to be. And if the outcomes that happen in these nations don't, morally move your soul. I mean, think of what happened to our own country. I mean, we have all this debt now. We have veterans on the streets. We have record high suicide rates among our veterans. All these things should really righteously anger you, that our leaders who never, don't like to get behind, will get behind any war, but will never sign up their sons and daughters to fight in it. So I think that is one other aspect that could mobilize us to all be on the same page of this, that, we need to strive for diplomacy rather than war. And so with that, I think we should pivot to our discussion for today, which is, on the Supreme Court and their rulings this past Friday. So, Senator, would you like to take off on this topic?
Oh yeah, and Morgan, I'll mention before I start that tomorrow is Barbara and my 57th wedding anniversary, and so I'll be celebrating that with her. We're in such a mad race over everything we're doing that she told me this morning. She said, "Do you know this is our wedding anniversary?" I thought, "Oh my gosh!" But anyway,
Congratulations!
57 wonderful years, and so with that, let me get started. We don't have too much time to cover the major cases, but I'd like to especially start with the real blockbuster, which was Trump versus Casa. And this is a case in which there was a case that was over the issue of birthright citizenship and whether Trump's executive order that ended birthright citizenship was valid or not. And we can get into that later. But in any event, the case did not decide that, but it decided actually a far more far-reaching issue. And this case represents a seismic shift in judicial power away from the lower Article 3 federal courts and back to the executive branch, the president. And what it was is it dealt with this case of whether individual district courts, the trial level, the lower level trial courts in the federal judiciary, there are 94 of them across the country, whether one district, a district court has a geographical boundary, just like a district for the House of Representatives, for the U.S. House of Representatives, has a specific geographical boundary. And so normally you would think it's called a district court because it represents a district, or it administers law within a district. So you would think that their rulings would cover that district. And that was the way that it was up until about 1963. And at that point, you had a very radical court, the Warren Court, that just began to sort of shred the U.S. Constitution, and just they were talking about the Constitution was a living document. Well, constitutions are designed to be fixed and immobile. Constitutions are supposed to be an anchor where you're always pulled back to the reality of how you were established and what you were supposed to be. And the Warren Court said, oh, no, we don't need, we'll cut the rope on this anchor and we'll just drift wherever the heck we want to go. And so the federal judiciary became a very dictatorial branch. And so it's not coincidental that it was in '63 that you had this movement of nationwide injunctions. Apparently, the first one was issued by the district court in Washington, D.C. Obviously, the most unrepresentative part of the entire country. They would issue a ruling that would suddenly govern the law throughout the entire United States. And now it was not used very much, but then over time it's become more and more used. But it wasn't until the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, that there was an explosion. And it was almost like a judicial revolution where, now I'm sure that some of these nationwide injunctions were issued in good faith, the rulings, because there were many areas where the Trump administration was testing established precedent. But there were others where I think the great majority of these came out of 5 districts that were chosen by the Democrats to create issues for them. And you could almost walk in these and wave something around, say, the Trump administration did this. All right, it's enjoined. You know, it's outrageous. Whatever it is, it's outrageous. I mean, it just got crazy where the district courts were headed. And some would say what I just said is extreme, and it is. I'm using a little expansiveness in what I'm saying, but anyway, the courts really seem to just feed off one another to take actions that were in excess of their power, and so we had this movement towards nationwide injunction. It finally reached a point where it really upset Congress. There was a bill that's actually in the Senate now to end nationwide injunctions, and the Supreme Court has taken care of it. And they said no more of these nationwide injunctions. You can only issue rulings for parties that are involved in a lawsuit. You can't say, well, okay, this person has sued to get a remedy for their issue, and you can just suddenly bring in all of the parties that are somewhat similar throughout the country and issue a ruling for everybody in the country. So what it's done, the Constitution is in large part, it centers around the first 3 articles, which are the 3 branches of government. And the first article, Article 1 of the Constitution, deals with the legislative branch, Congress, and it gives them certain powers. The second article, Article 2, is the executive branch. That's the president and all of the federal bureaucracy, and they have certain powers. Then Article 3 is the judicial branch, and that's the Supreme Court and whatever lesser courts are established by Congress. They have certain powers. And the history of the United States involves some jockeying among these 3 branches. And to some extent, this was anticipated by the founders. to have power pitted against power.
Mm-hmm.
And by having powerful individuals and powerful forces pitted against one another, you keep them fighting one another instead of fighting against the people. And this keeps the people supreme and allows the people to have a genuine voice in their government. And so anyway, this is where we stand right now. The universal injunction was non-existent for most of our country's history, according to Justice Barrett, who wrote the opinion of the court. And I would say that the ruling vindicates Attorney General Pam Bondi's very aggressive litigation to restore the original meaning of the Constitution's separation of powers doctrine. You know, Morgan, when I was first elected to the House of Delegates back in the late 90s, it was the first time that Republicans had controlled the House of Delegates since Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. And it was a dramatic, explosive event in Virginia. And so there was a great deal of interest in all of my campaigns because people were saying, what happened here? You know, this guy was not supposed to win. And so I was contacted by it must have been out of the governor's office. They said, we've got this group of journalists from South Korea, and they want to tag along with your campaign. They want to see what's an American campaign like. This was the most exciting one around at the time. So the group, they were described to me as being from the equivalent of the South Korean Washington Post. And so they followed me around at different campaign events and speeches and so forth. And as they did, they asked me at one time, they said, do you think you have a good form of government? I said, yes, I do. And they said, what is the strength of the American government? And I said, the strength of it, a lot of people say it's because we have elections. I said, but all countries, you know, not all, but most of them have some form of elections. I said, so that's not it. But what it is, it's the separation of powers. It's the setting up of power against power, this division of powers that helps to preserve the Constitution. And then they said, well, what's the greatest weakness that you have? And I said, the greatest weakness is that there were inadequate checks and balances on the judiciary branch, because people didn't anticipate that the federal judiciary would gain the enormous power that it has. And so it's interesting that what is happening here is that the federal judiciary has been pushed back within its ballpark.
Contained a little bit, yeah. It's very important to stress that, you know, even within the ruling, it's portrayed in a lot of left-leaning media that this was another strike towards fascism under the Trump administration. But the court ruling explicitly says, no, the states still have, you know, the ability, or the district courts within their district, to provide remedy if this executive order places inextricable harm on individuals that are in this case. And it said that even with the birthright executive order, if they are able to come and, you know, provide actual people that it has harm towards, they can seek remedy. And I think that's a very important thing to point out, because a lot of the media is kind of running around with their heads cut off, acting like this is it's just the end of American greatness, which I find that very funny, because they like to exploit ignorance among the people without actually getting into the nooks and crannies of what the actual issue at play is.
Something else, Morgan, is that this is a two-edged sword. This is now, it's not a two-edged sword for Donald Trump, because he's one and done. He's got a 4-year term, and then he goes into retirement and runs his hotels. But if it works for a Republican president, it works for a Democrat president. And there are valid concerns that, I don't want to sound like I'm siding with this very radical minority on the Supreme Court, but there is genuine concern, of course. How much power should the presidency have? And so that will be wrestled out. When you are in your rocking chair someday, if the country still exists, there will continue to be this struggle back and forth about the extent of executive power, legislative power, judicial power. Mm-hmm. And so even though people are very dismissive of the minority opinions, with some reason, they're not entirely off base. And so while, I'm just very pleased by the decision, I'm sure there are going to be times when we look back and say, oh boy, maybe it would have been nice to have that old situation back. But the executive is designed to be a more robust, it's designed to be more responsive to the will of the people. And unless the executive branch acts with authority, it can't really carry out the will of the voters. And so it's a very complex thing, but I think it's a good, on balance, a very, very good, very powerful decision.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that, that we will have a day where there is a Democratic president. And, some of the articles that I was reading on this, it says a lot of the nationwide injunctions happened under the Biden or Obama Biden administration. I think it was the student loan debt forgiveness.
Yes.
And that was the nationwide injunction that was put on that. So that's very interesting to keep that in mind, that, there will become a day where we don't have Donald Trump as president, and the left that's kind of acting very irrational with this ruling, instead of bringing forth, the actual facts to the people, it will serve them one day, and they will somehow forget how this was what they quoted as a fascist movement. So,
whichever party controls the presidency will be very pleased with this ruling, and the other one will be a little bit regretful about what happened.
And I think it's important for us to kind of use the last few minutes of this discussion here is to actually go into Donald Trump's executive order, protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. Would you like to go into this further, just to bring forth the actual information to the people? I know a lot of this through mainstream media, it's portrayed as any child that's born as their citizenship is in question, and this is completely goes against our Constitution. So I wanted to give this moment for you to talk about that.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says that children born within and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States are citizens, something called birthright citizenship. Now, the wording of it suggests that anybody who who gives birth here in this country gives birth to an American citizen. And that sort of was everybody's belief until people started digging more deeply and looking into the history. The way that we analyze the Constitution is to look at the situation that existed at the time that provisions were enacted, because that's the only way that we can give them any historical context. Now, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which has the birthright citizenship provision, was enacted in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Now, you need to just look at it in a rather cold way and say, the 14th Amendment was designed to deal with the issue that slaves had just moved from being property. And it was upheld by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court recognized them as property, and so we had Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the South. Didn't free them in the North. He didn't want that to happen because he'd lose support in states like Maryland and Delaware that were reliant on slaves. So, but they were freed in the South. There was I bet there was not one person in the South from that day forward who ever said we ought to return to slavery. It was done. It was a dead institution. It survived, and there was resistance in the North to ending slavery. The last state that ended slavery didn't do so voluntarily, but it was Joe Biden's own state of Delaware. Delaware refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, and so the amendment was ratified and became law without Delaware's participation. And when it did, that ended slavery in the United States. I think instead of celebrating Juneteenth, which always sounds awfully goofy and demeaning to me, the idea they ought to erase that and come up with a day that shows when slavery ended in Delaware, in the northern state of Delaware. But in any event, so the country was going through this transition. Finally, slavery had been stamped out everywhere, but there were collateral things to deal with. So you emancipated the slaves, but what happened when they bore children? Were the children to be slaves? Well, people didn't want that, but we needed something to make it crystal clear that you couldn't say, well, okay, Mammy, you just had a baby and you're not a slave anymore, but listen, this child is, we'd like to pay you a few dollars. This was nightmarish stuff. Nobody was going to allow the children of slaves to become slaves themselves. And so the 14th Amendment was enacted. The birthright citizenship provision was enacted to protect future generations of African Americans, specifically the children of former slaves, to declare them as full and equal citizens in the United States, entitled to all the rights and responsibilities and privileges of anyone else born in the country. Now, it was never anticipated, and this was, keep in mind, this issue of how to deal with Black Americans was a monumental thing after the Civil War. Personally, I don't believe the Civil War was fought over slavery. President Lincoln said that he said, if I can preserve the Union and not free a single slave, I will do so. There were huge economic things at work, and one of them was sort of the internet of the day, or the AI of the day, which was the transcontinental railroad. In the North, industrial North wanted a northerly route for the transcontinental railway that would feed power into the North. In the South, they wanted a southerly route that would feed power into the agricultural South. And this was a tremendous thing in the war. Abraham Lincoln was a railroad lawyer. He was well connected with these huge railroad corporations. And while it's quaint stuff, railroads and stuff, railroads in those days were as explosive as artificial intelligence and the internet, things like that, are to us today.
Mm-hmm.
So these were real powerhouses. These were we talk about the globalist billionaires. These were the globalist billionaires of the day. And so they were able to move media and resources and so forth. And it's sort of like today you have the pro-life and the pro-abortion movement. And if one part of the country was to try to start war against the other part, they would want a big coalition. And if their area was pro-choice, they'd probably want to make that part of their plank. Or if it was pro-life, they want to make that a part of their plank. And this was the same way with abolition of slavery. It was a very similar type of movement. So it didn't start off as a movement for or against abolition, but it started off, and that was certainly a big issue, but as time went on, it became a political and to some extent a military tool. This idea, you free the slaves might revolt, they might take down all of the plantations and so forth. It did not work, to the credit of the slaves in the South, that they did not turn on the people who ran the plantations in a violent way. And by then the men were gone, so you had sort of the ladies of the plantation, doing the best they could to run things. And there were elements within the leadership of the Union Army and the federal government that believed that if the slaves were emancipated, then there would be a slave uprising, as had occurred against the French in the colony of Haiti, when in 1804 there was a Haitian genocide that exterminated almost all of the white population of Haiti. And so there was a feeling that, well, if we take this wounded South that's lost so many of its men and its leaders, if we unleash a slave rebellion, it'll topple the South overnight and end the war. It did not happen, and I think it says something for the relationship between the slaves and the people who, they jointly worked the land and felt an attachment to it. And anyway, it didn't work. But in any event, so here the country was now coming to grips with this tremendous issue. And the issue was solely and strictly focused on the future of the children of slaves and moving them up now to where the idea of property is gone and dead and will never return. And now the idea is we will make these young newborn Black children full Americans, just as a newborn white infant or newborn Hispanic or whatever, just as they are, they will be full citizens. But it never, I mean, nobody ever would have imagined that somebody would fly in from some other country, well, not fly in, but sail in from another country and touch on shore, go into a hospital, give birth, get on the ship and go back home. And hey, you got citizenship. Isn't this cool? Let's get a piece of paper. The 14th Amendment would have been drafted differently had anyone remotely conceived of this. So it's an important issue, and one that we'll be following with great interest.
It's very important that we have the historical context of this. You know, a lot of it's lost in our education that isn't that grand in relaying American history. But I do want to call attention to what the actual executive order states. The new policy that it wants to enact, basically on who is a citizen when they're born here. It's when either the mother is unlawfully present in the United States and the father or the mother, this is goes both ways. This is kind of just 2 points in the policy. If one of the parents is here unlawfully while the other parent is here maybe lawfully on a visa, that is when the question of citizenship comes into play. So you can have a person that is kind of here not legally, but if the other parent is an actual citizen of the United States, this child will be a citizen. So I feel like that's kind of important to make a mention of, because a lot of people act like this is just throwing everything out, and every child that's born here is going to be given a survey whether they should be a citizen or not. So I felt like that was kind of important to note.
Yes.
Would you like to give closing remarks, Senator, and then we'll let you and your wife.
I'm just going to take one quick minute, and I'll just run through. There was an important decision dealing with free speech, and Supreme Court has ruled that the state of Texas can require age verification before individuals can access pornography sites. And this is Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. And it's a shift for the Supreme Court, which used to be extremely sort of subservient to the whole pornography industry. And now they're saying that the focus is really going to be on protecting children from material that's deemed obscene to minors. And we're not going to have this strict scrutiny that makes it almost impossible to have any sort of restrictions on pornography. But in any event, it's going to mean that the state of Texas and soon other states will be able to require people to verify their age before they access pornography online. That's a very painful ruling for the immense pornography industry in the United States. There's another case dealing with the transgender movement, and the Supreme Court ruled that parents have a right to opt their children out of classes that involved LGBT books and LGBT themes and so forth. And this is another in a series of relentless setbacks for the transgender movement, and chips away at this sexual grooming of children in public schools that it's just almost unbelievable that 20 years ago, anybody who heard that you'd have these transgender men wearing sexualized outfits and grooming children in schools, they would have thought you needed to be in an asylum. No, that could never happen in a rational culture. So I think we're in the process of starting to get that genie back in the bottle. Another case that's going to be of real importance to a lot of people is Medina versus Planned Parenthood, South Atlantic. And in this case, the Supreme Court has ruled that individual states have the power to exclude Planned Parenthood from their Medicaid programs. And basically, they've said that the law does not allow individuals who receive Medicaid to sue the states for the specific providers that provide those benefits. Excuse me. And finally, another important case deals with it's United States versus Skirmetti, deals with the transgender healthcare ban in Tennessee. And the court has affirmed Tennessee's ban on gender affirming care. I hate that term. It's not gender affirming, it's gender denying care. And it really amounts to nothing more than the sexual mutilation of children through surgery. But we are going to see a time in the not too distant future where people will recoil at the idea that in America we once allowed doctors and organizations to take minor children and cut off their body parts and grind out their inner organs because of a sexual ideology. It is one of the most hideous things in my lifetime. I lived in the last year of the Nazi regime. I lived when Joseph Stalin was executing vast numbers of people. I lived when Mao Zedong starved 50 million Chinese. And I would say that the transgender surgeries certainly should be the type of thing that would be eternally remembered as one of the most hideous events in American history. I consider the surgical mutilation of a child to be a crime against humanity that warrants the death penalty, whether it's a surgery that's carried out by a so-called doctor, or whether it's somebody who assists in that surgery. Just as we pursue Nazi war criminals, even to this day when they're all in their, almost 100 years old, I think we should do the same thing with the people who have mutilated poor innocent children and taken advantage of them just because of this bizarre fad of transgenderism. It's a terribly sick and distorted movement that takes advantage of people's mental disorder and uses it against them. And I just mentioned my daughter attends a big mega church. It's a wonderful church, and they had this man and his son who would come in, and the man he wore these bizarre setups. He was one of these transgender people who had transitioned to become a woman, so-called. They were very courteous with him. They would not allow him to use the women's room. They would guard those, but they were very courteous, and he was always welcome. But he was well known in the church. Thousands of people saw him. And then one day, the man committed suicide. And I think people were saddened to hear that. But what was then so shocking was they showed a picture of him before he transitioned. And I'm going to tell you, you look at him and you say, that's a handsome young man. He looked totally normal. And you think, here was a man who was surgically mutilated and then struggled to become what he was not, had a son, and then he commits suicide. And I'm going to tell you, looking at the before and after, it was just a heart-wrenching experience for the thousands of people who attended that church, because they treated this man with enormous care and dignity, but they wouldn't go outside of the realm. They would not begin to condone this type of abnormal behavior, but they treated him with respect. They didn't bar him from entering the church. And so there will come a time when we look back on that, and it'll be the same as we look at people being executed by Nazis or by some of the communist demons in the world. So anyway, these are some pretty far-reaching decisions by the Supreme Court, very, very sound decisions, and there'll be lots more to come.
Certainly will. Yes, I'm glad that we were able to go through all of the court cases. I thought we were kind of short on time, but I'm glad that we got to get through to that. And want to thank everybody for watching, and join us next week to focus on the news.
Thank you, Morgan.